Planning a funeral is a consumer purchase no one wants to make. You're at your most vulnerable, trying to deal with the loss of a loved one while being asked to make hasty and costly decisions that might not make sense if you had a little more time. I'm Herb Weisbaum, the Consumer Man, a contributing editor at checkbook.org.
Welcome to Consumerpedia at checkbook.org. We're the nonprofit that helps consumers select services, avoid trouble, and save money. Because we don't accept any advertising or take money from any business we recommend, you can rely on checkbook.org to be completely independent and objective. Now, here's the host of Consumerpedia, America's consumer expert, the Consumer Man, Herb Weisbaum.
In this episode of Consumerpedia, we'll talk about your choices, what a funeral home is required to do, and the marketing tricks they sometimes use to push their high-end products. Plus, the importance of pre-planning your funeral. Checkbook's executive editor Kevin Brassler is here.
Hello, everyone.
Along with a special guest, Joshua Slocum. Josh is executive director of the Funeral Consumers Alliance, a national nonprofit that works to educate people about preparing for a funeral for themselves or a loved one, and they advocate for fair practices in the funeral industry. Josh is joining us today from Vermont. Thanks for doing this.
Hey, Herb. Thanks for having me.
So on the homepage of your website, funerals.org, it says, losing a loved one is hard, planning a funeral shouldn't be. Tell us what you mean by that and how you view the funeral industry.
Everybody knows it's one of the most difficult things that can happen to us is when we lose a loved one, when someone dies. We're not thinking straight. We're emotional. This is probably, for most of us, the first time, and it may be the only time, when we are an actual patron of a funeral home. This is not something we get practice at. It's not like buying a car or buying something you do over and over again. Most of us will only buy it for another person once or twice in our lives. What has happened in our system, and our system is that we turn our dead over to a third-party professional class, is that it has gotten very complicated, or it has seemed to be complicated to people. And we have been trained, and we've trained ourselves as consumers to expect that funeral costs will be burdensome. Funeral Consumers Alliance's message is, you can control how much you spend if you are willing to separate the emotion of showing love for a person who's died from the amount of money that you spend on their funeral.
And of course, there's no relationship whatsoever.
None at all. But most of us emotionally believe there is. This is a normal thing for people. They say, I want to make sure that I bury my mother the right way. And that's fine. It's a normal emotion. But I often ask people to remember, the right way has a very odd proclivity. It matches up to what's most expensive at the funeral home.
Well, as we'll talk about throughout this podcast, the funeral home industry is a business, and their goal, while they're there to serve you, is, as with any other business, to make as much money as they possibly can.
Correct. And there's nothing wrong with that. We are not an anti-funeral industry organization. We just want transparency. We would like an educated consumer, hopefully somebody who's planned ahead and done a little bit of shopping around and finds a business that they feel treats them well, but also that gives them fair prices.
If you do it the right way and pre-shop for the funeral, how do you find a funeral home, especially if you've never used one before? Where do you start?
You start the very same way that you would start for anything else. So imagine that you asked me, hey, I'm shopping for a car. How do I find a car dealer? Herb, how would you find a car dealer?
Probably ask some friends where they bought their car.
Okay. Might you also go online?
Sure.
Right. So what I'm doing here, I am being actually a little didactic. I'm trying to illustrate that we believe there's a mystery, but there isn't actually a mystery. Everything you need to know about how to plan a funeral affordably and to your taste, these are the very same skills that everyone listening already has. It's the emotion and the fear of the death that makes us believe that it's complicated. So I'll give you concrete examples.
Sure.
Number one, here's what I suggest to people. First things first, check our website to see if there's a local chapter of Funeral Consumers Alliance that is near you. Why? Because our groups have done cost comparison surveys of the funeral homes and sometimes the cemeteries in their service area. You can go on their website and take a look and see, oh my gosh, if I want a simple cremation in Jonesboro, I can go to one place and it's going to be $900, but if I go to another place in the same city, it's going to be $3,500. That's the power of shopping around. The price difference between funeral homes in your city, listener, maybe even within 2 miles of your own house, the price for the same services varies dramatically. We're not talking about a 15% or 20% profit margin difference. We're talking factors of 2, 3, or 4 times. literally making a phone call and getting a price quote before you commit to a funeral home, that simple act alone may save you $2,000. If you don't want to check online, and a lot of funeral homes don't put their prices on their website. That's something we're working to change. But federal law requires funeral homes to give you, the consumer, price quotes by phone. No questions asked. You don't have to be a certain person to qualify for it. If you don't have a volunteer funeral consumer group, so let's say that one of my chapters is not in your area, what do you do then? Very easy. Make a list of 5 or 6 funeral homes that are within, say, 20 to 30 miles of where you live. How do you make that list? Again, you already know how to do this. You go online or you open a phone book if anyone still uses those. Same thing you do for other businesses. That's how you find them. Call each of them, ask them for a price quote, but more important than that, ask the funeral home if they will voluntarily email you a copy of their complete price and service list. Those who will comply with that are giving you information that you need to make a comparison. Remember, funeral homes, by federal law, are required to give you prices by phone. They're required to hand you a paper price list if you inquire in person, but they are not required to email it to you. So if you find funeral homes that are not willing to do that, you just got good information. Cross them off your list. This is not somebody you want to do business with if they're cagey about giving you their prices before you sit in front of them in the funeral home.
Kevin, Secret Shoppers for Checkbook went around and actually priced the same service at different funeral homes in the same city, and no surprise here, as Josh just mentioned, we found huge differences. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, massive differences. As Josh mentioned, just for the same service, you can end up paying thousands of dollars more simply by selecting the wrong funeral home, the more expensive funeral homes. So, for example, here in the Washington area, the price for direct cremation among funeral homes we surveyed ranged from $600 to more than $4,000 for the exact same services. The average price for cremation was about $1,900. And for a sample traditional funeral, where we asked each funeral home to price things according to the exact same arrangements that we wanted, the prices we were quoted ranged from $5,500 to more than $15,000. That's a $10,000 spread between the lowest cost funeral home and the highest cost one. And a big part of these price differences was not just for the professional services, but also the casket. Casket prices, those often represent the biggest profit centers for funeral homes. For the least expensive oaked casket that we asked for, prices ranged from, in the Washington area, $1,300 at local funeral homes to $8,900. Huge price differences for what is essentially the same thing. And so, is it easy to shop around for funeral home prices? Well, it actually is. Local consumer funeral alliances make it easy. Consumers Checkbook, in the markets that we serve, we've done our own shopping. We have price information on lots of funeral homes. And the funeral homes you want to work with, as Joshua mentioned, will send you their price lists. And so it does make sense to, in advance, pre-plan your own funeral. You'd be doing your heirs, your survivors, and your family a big favor by doing that.
Kevin, there's nothing wrong with spending a lot of money on a loved one's funeral if that's what you really want. I think the problem is when you get the upsell from the funeral director who tries to convince you to spend more money than you really want to spend. I had that in my situation when my father passed away, and that was, 40 years ago right now. Didn't have a clue as to what was going on and got talked into this enormously beautiful cherry wood with brass handles casket and we had no idea what we were doing and spent thousands of dollars that we probably wouldn't have spent because that's what the funeral director directed us to.
Yeah, and a lot of these funeral homes by design are set up to get you to spend more. They put the expensive caskets up front and they direct you toward them first, and you don't know. Sometimes at some funeral homes we've seen there's a back room where the least expensive caskets are stashed. They don't, readily inform you that you can shop around for caskets, that there are other sellers, there are online sellers, even Costco sells caskets now, and funeral homes by law have to accept your casket if you want to provide one. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, the big profit centers for funeral homes are caskets, and you can save a lot of money by shopping around and buying your casket elsewhere. So I do think that consumers need to go into this with an understanding of, as you mentioned earlier, Herb, that funeral homes are mostly for-profit businesses and they're looking to maximize their sale. And so you do need to be careful. Funeral directors and salespeople have a lot of experience. And I hate to be crass, but with death and dealing with families that are bereaving someone, right? They're in an awful position here, and then there's a time crunch. The funeral is going to be in a few days. They have to make decisions pretty quickly. And at that point, they don't have a lot of time to shop around. So it does make sense for individuals to do their relatives a massive favor and decide on these things in advance. Decide on the services they want. Decide on maybe even what funeral home they want to handle those services. For example, you're okay with cremation. That's usually a huge way to save money on funeral expenses. If you don't care about things like whether your body is on display for your funeral, make sure your loved ones know that. Write it down and tell them, because that's another way to save money, is not having to be embalmed and have all the makeup and hair and all that done and dressing done. The more you can do to plan your own funeral in advance, the better. It will help your relatives not have to make all these decisions, and it will also help them, not be maybe manipulated by a salesperson or a funeral director whose best interests are to make them money as opposed to making sure that your funeral costs don't explode.
Now, for a traditional burial, the casket's probably the biggest expense. And straight ahead, some tips on shopping for a casket or renting one if you prefer. This is Consumerpedia, powered by checkbook.org.
Checkbook has customer ratings and evaluations for funeral homes in these 7 metro areas: Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, Seattle, San Francisco, Minneapolis-St. Paul, and Washington, D.C. The ratings are available with a subscription. Tips on how to plan and pay for a funeral are free to everyone at checkbook.org. If you live in one of these 7 areas and haven't joined Checkbook yet, check us out. Get a free 30-day subscription by going to checkbook.org/Consumerpedia.
Shopping for a coffin can be a real challenge, as I found out when my father died. There were so many styles, from basic to plush to over the top. Prices can range from under $1,000 to more than $25,000. Kevin, a lot of people might not know it, but you don't have to buy the coffin from the funeral home, and Checkbook shoppers found that you can find a great selection at lower prices by going online.
Yeah, we found that by far the source of the least expensive caskets are from online sellers. Costco also sells caskets. And what funeral homes might not tell you is that you don't have to buy a casket from the business that's arranging the funeral, that you can go out and buy your own. It's pretty easy to shop around for these things. They ship overnight. And the funeral homes have to accept caskets that you've purchased from third parties. And so I do think it makes sense to do some shopping around and make sure that you can't save a bundle, and you usually can, by providing your own casket.
One thing I would add to Kevin's good advice there on caskets, it's important also to shop around for service prices. The casket alone may not save you money unless you are combining that with a funeral home that also has reasonable service fees, because there are ways that they make that difference up in profit if you don't buy the casket from them.
Josh, I bet a lot of people don't realize that you can actually, in some cases, or I guess maybe every case, rent a casket from the funeral home if you want to have a display, but you're going to cremate the person, or you just want to put them in a plain pine box or something when you put them in the ground. Talk about that if you would.
When it comes to renting caskets, yes, most funeral homes these days will rent you a ceremonial casket that you can have a viewing in. Inside, it looks exactly like everything else. It's got the bedding, the lining, but inside is a removable container. It's made out of, heavy cardboard or fiberboard. And that gets taken out of that ceremonial display shell of the casket, and that accompanies the body to the crematory. There's no reason it can't be used for burial as well.
We mentioned earlier about having the showrooms set up in a situation where it tries to drive you to the higher priced coffins. I would assume, Josh and Kevin, that every possible option is not in that display room, and that you might want to, if you're there doing it that way, ask, are there other options that are lower priced that I can look at?
Correct. Don't assume that the least expensive caskets are on display, because many times they are not. And almost all funeral homes have access to a huge variety of caskets that can be ordered from the casket wholesalers and delivered within 24 hours. What you see on the showroom floor is nowhere near the universe of what's available, so definitely ask.
Now, in this country, cremation is the number one way of taking care of a loved one after they die. So you don't need a coffin for a cremation, and a lot of people may not know you can use your own urn or whatever thing you want to have the ashes put back in. You don't have to buy some expensive, beautiful urn from the funeral parlor.
Yeah, that's right. You certainly can. I mean, if you want something nice for display. Funeral homes have a wide selection, but really all you need, part of demystifying this is putting it into plain terms. I'm not trying to be glib. I'm just trying to get people down to basic reality. An urn only becomes an urn when we decide that its only use is for cremated remains. You can use a cookie jar if grandma was a prize-winning baker, and some people have. Other people use dad's fishing tackle box. Still, other people will get, a piece of sculpture that's hollow inside that looks beautiful to them. Anything can be an urn. Just depends on what you use it for.
We mentioned before about the fact that funeral homes are not required to put their pricing information online. Some do, about 1 in 4 do, but they're not required to. Kevin, why does that bother you? Why do you think they should be required to put this information online?
I think we need to revise the FTC's regulations in terms of what they demand of funeral homes, in terms of disclosing pricing. The original rule was written before there was an internet. It used to be that, if you showed up in person, they would have to hand over to you their price list. But there's no requirement that a funeral home email you a price list or display it online. And the reason there's no requirement is that when the FTC made the rule, those things didn't exist. I think it makes sense for the FTC to revise its rule and to require funeral homes to publish their lists online if they have a website, and most do, and it would be easy to do that, and to provide via email their price lists if requested. A big problem we've seen is that, when our shoppers ask funeral homes for their price lists, they'll say, well, no, I won't give it to you unless you walk in here. I won't email it to you. That's just not fair. It's better for consumers when they have the information they need to make these decisions, to where they don't have to go into these funeral homes and really, in some cases, get worked over by a funeral director.
Josh, when I did a story about this with consumer advocates pushing for the price list to be online, I spoke to you, and I also spoke to the Funeral Directors Association. They told me, well, we just give much more personalized service. We really want to discuss it with the family. You have a thought as to why they want to get you in the door.
Yeah, gee, I wonder what that would be. Can you imagine a restaurant saying, no, I won't give you a menu, or a car dealer saying, no, I won't tell you what my stock is? This just doesn't exist outside of the funeral industry in any way that I can see. And this is why we have something called the FTC funeral rule that requires that paper price list to be handed out, because the FTC recognized that funeral homes will not voluntarily do the normal things that other retailers in the marketplace will voluntarily do. They have to be compelled. Why do they have to be compelled? Because it's much easier to sell you a lot more if they can get you into a private sales room and use excuses like, oh, it's very personal, it's very personal. Yeah, a lot of things are very personal, but everything still costs money. I think that's why.
There are some things you should do and you should not do as you plan your ultimate demise. We're going to talk about that next. This is Consumerpedia, powered by checkbook.org.
Consumerpedia Fast Facts. In 2020, more than half, 56% of Americans who died were cremated. That's more than double the 27% who were cremated 2 decades earlier. The median price for a funeral with burial and viewing is now $7,800, according to the National Funeral Directors Association, while the median cost of cremation is $2,500. America's oldest cemetery is the Miles Standish Cemetery in Duxbury, Massachusetts. It was built in 1893.
So we're talking funerals with Kevin Brassler, executive editor of checkbook.org, and Joshua Slocum, executive director of the Funeral Consumers Alliance. That's a national nonprofit that works to both educate people about preparing for a funeral for themselves or a loved one and advocates for fair practices in the funeral industry. You can find them on the web at funerals.org. Kevin, Americans don't like to talk about death. We don't want to plan for it. We just figure someone else is going to take care of all the details when we pass away. I assume it would be easier if families talked about this and shared their wishes.
Yeah, it would be so much easier, and it would be a thoughtful thing to do for you to write down your wishes in advance. What you want your funeral service to look like. Do you even want a funeral at all? A lot of folks these days are cremated, or what's done is called immediate burial, where their body is just sounds like they're immediately buried, and then later on they have a memorial service or a party or something. If that's what you want, make sure your relatives know that. I've had two different experiences in this. My father, who is still alive, has written every detail down of what he wants his funeral to be like, including the hymns he wants sung, the types of things people might say about him. And the reason is that my father is a minister and he's done hundreds of funerals, and he knows, he's seen that a lot of families just aren't prepared for this because the person who passed away just did not pass along their wishes. The flip side was when my mother died, we really didn't know what she wanted. She hadn't really very well described what that might be. And so we had a very nice, but also I think a pretty elaborate funeral. And it was a costly one. And it was a costly one at the time to where we just really have time to think about things. And I think if we had spent more time thinking about it and more time considering what her wishes might have been, it might have not been so expensive. And so it's just very thoughtful for you to think in advance of what you might want and make sure your relatives know that, so that when they are presented with this sales presentation from these funeral homes, that they can push back and say, no, that's not what mom or dad would want. I know that because I spoke with them about this.
I can't agree with you more. I talked earlier about when my father passed away. It was the first death in the family that my brother and I were responsible for. We were in Hawaii vacationing at the time, had to fly 24 hours back home to deal with things, had no idea what we were doing, got talked into the very expensive cherry wood coffin. And then years later, my mother was talking to us. She said, when I go, I want to be buried in the traditional Jewish way. I want to be in a shroud. I want to be in a plain pine box. I don't want all that money wasted on me. And when she finally passed away, it made it a whole lot easier to know what mom actually wanted. Went to the funeral home and said, put her in a shroud and put her in a pine box, and that's what she wants.
Yeah, what you both are saying is very, very sensible. I like to ask people to try on a slightly different perspective. I no longer believe in dictates from beyond the grave. So when I speak to consumers and when I give advice, I used to say this, but I no longer say it. I don't say tell them what you want. I suggest have a conversation with them and remember to ask your survivors what they might want or need. Believe it or not, your funeral isn't actually all about you. We all talk about it like it's that way, but it isn't. It's for the people who are still there experiencing your loss. They matter, their finances matter, their emotional needs matter. I've seen a lot of cases where well-meaning parents went into great detail or wrote things down or even just orally spoke them. One example, a lady from Tennessee said, my mother told me the only thing that mattered to her in the funeral was that she be buried next to my father. She didn't need anything elaborate. She just wanted to be buried next to dad. Well, what happened was by the time mom's death came around, mom lived literally on the other side of the country, and the cost of transporting her coffin back to the state of Maine, where no family members lived or gathered, was so prohibitive. This woman was in tears on the phone with me saying, I'm going to fail my mother. And what I say to people is, remember to ask your survivors, remember that they're going to have needs as well. Have a conversation with them. You may come up with a funeral that works for both parties.
If the death is sudden, you may not be able to do a lot of pre-planning if you haven't done it already, like the price shopping. Kevin, Checkbook says never go to that funeral home alone. Talk about that if you would.
Yeah, I think it's really important to take along a friend or at least another relative. Don't go yourself. Just to help give you some perspective, just to help you, maybe push back against a funeral director that's trying to get you to make a decision based on guilt or other emotions rather than, as Joshua said, is this good for the family? Would this be a good celebration of the person's life? Is this what the deceased person would want? Again, it's the case of my mother. I'm not sure what services she wanted. She didn't really communicate it well. And in the end, I wasn't the one who had to make these decisions, but the people who did make them, I think, upon further reflection, might have wished they hadn't spent so much money, may have, selected fewer services than we have. It's better to have someone with you as an independent third party, especially, somebody who maybe is not as emotionally connected to the person who's died to help make decisions.
Final point, and this is a really important one. Both of you advise to pre-plan a funeral, but not to prepay for a funeral. Kevin, could you explain what prepaid funerals are and why Checkbook opposes them?
Yeah, this is critical. Most funeral homes will let you pay in advance for your own services. They'll say, well, this way you don't have to worry about your relatives pulling together the money needed to bury you, to have the funeral. And while that seems to make sense, we've seen and heard of a lot of problems with prepaid funerals. That the funeral home changes changes hands and the contract's no longer honored. We see a lot of times that prices go up, and so the prepaid amounts that were put in, they don't cover the full costs. And often the prepaid funeral contracts, they don't include things like honorariums for clergy or for the singers and flowers and all kinds of different things. There's all kinds of exclusions. In the end, it's always best to control your own money, to not put money in advance into this business. Just hold on to your own money and have it spent accordingly when you die. There's an easy way to do this. You can put that money, instead of prepaying for your funeral, put that money in a bank account that is designated as transferable upon death to a relative who can make these decisions for you. It's easy to do that. You can even put that in an account that's specially set up to where the money transfers to the funeral home upon your death, your selected funeral home. It's better to do that than to pay in advance to some company that you just don't know what its history will be going forward.
Josh, I assume you agree?
Yeah, I do agree. There's one instance in which it may be a good idea for some consumers to prepay, and that is if they are facing a Medicaid spend down, if they're going to be going on Medicaid, for example, for nursing home care. Medicaid will allow you to prepay a funeral. Each state has a different limit, a cap on that. And they will not count that funeral money against you when determining eligibility. But I can tell you from experience that this is the minority of prepaid funerals. Many people prepay them believing that they're going to save money or that it's going to take care of everything. And as Kevin said, there are a lot of things that can't be included. And depending on what state you live in, the laws may be set up in such a way that the funeral home is able to be entitled to more of that money. You may actually lose money by prepaying because you've given up the interest and all the accrued value in that account. So definitely plan ahead. Think very carefully before paying ahead.
What about buying your plot in the cemetery? I know, especially with a lot of Jewish people who want to be in a Jewish cemetery, they buy the plot ahead of time because they want to be in a specific area or next to other relatives. Is there anything wrong with doing that?
There's nothing wrong with it, but be realistic, okay? If you're a 50-year-old and you say, I want to be buried in Pine Lawn Cemetery, are you absolutely certain that when you are 80 years old, you are still going to be living in the same town as Pine Lawn Cemetery? And are you absolutely certain that no matter where you die in the world, that's what you want and that's what's going to be the best? I can tell you from talking to consumers on the phone, there are way more people out there trying to offload graves they pre-bought than there are people to buy them because we don't live in the same area for a long time like we used to. If your heart is set on a particular cemetery, absolutely you can go ahead and do that. But be aware that when you pre-buy a grave, you're usually not pre-buying the expensive services that go along with it. Opening and closing the grave, vaults that cemeteries require, vault setting fees. Don't tell your kids everything's taken care of at the cemetery. It is not. They are going to face additional expenses of at least $2,000 on average.
Before we go, Josh, could you tell us how your group, Funeral Consumers Alliance, can help folks with all the stuff we've been talking about and possibly refer them to nonprofits in their area?
Sure. We have a website with a comprehensive library of plain English, straight to the point articles and tip sheets for consumers. Funerals.org, making sure you have the S on the word funerals. You can click on our consumer section. Nearly everything on this site is absolutely free and shareable. We have a list of our local chapters around the country that have done price surveys. I encourage you to check that out. If there's something that we can do to help answer a specific question that's not addressed, we're happy to help those people too.
Thank you, Josh. Thanks, Kevin. A lot of really important information there. And with that, we come to the end of another edition of Consumerpedia. If you'd like to support the show, please rate this episode and subscribe to Consumerpedia on Apple or Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Remember, we release a new episode every other Thursday. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Consumerpedia or on Twitter at MyConsumerpedia. I'm Herb Weisbaum, checkbook.org. Thanks for listening.
Consumerpedia is a public service of checkbook.org. We're a unique nonprofit that empowers you, the consumer, to save money and make smarter choices. From auto repair shops to doctors, plumbers to vets, you can count on checkbook.org to help you find the best services and avoid the worst. Local ratings are unbiased and accurate. If you live in or around these 7 cities and haven't joined Checkbook yet, check us out. Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, Seattle, San Francisco, Minneapolis-St. Paul, and Washington, D.C. To get your free 30-day subscription, go to checkbook.org/Consumerpedia. Consumerpedia, empowering consumers to save money and make smarter choices.